I still remember the smell of chocolate cake that morning, something my mom had never done before, not even on Thanksgiving or Christmas. She wasn't much of a cook, and if she ever walked into the kitchen, it was usually just to grab scissors to clip coupons off milk cartons. But that day, she baked. I should have known something was wrong. I had just turned 18, still wearing my old gray pajamas, hair tossed into a messy bun when my dad called me into the living room. He was sitting there, back pressed into his leather chair, eyes fixed on the floor. Mom sat beside him, hands clenched on her knees, avoiding my gaze. No one smiled. No happy birthday. Just silence. Long, heavy, and suffocating. "Sit down," Dad said, his voice low and cold, like the time I broke the dining room lamp in 6th grade. I did as he said, hands clutching the hem of my shirt. I could feel it. Everything I knew was about to change. Mom spoke first, every word stiff like she'd memorized them. "You were adopted." I froze. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. My ears went quiet. "We brought you home when you were almost 3, Dad added. "Your birth mother couldn't care for you. We did what we could." I swallowed hard, eyes locked on a loose thread in the carpet. No hugs. No tears. They spoke like they were announcing a change in bank policy. "It's time for you to go your own way," Mom said. Her voice didn't shake, but it wasn't warm either. Then Dad reached under his chair and pulled out a small canvas bag. He pushed it toward me. It thudded against the floor, heavier than it looked. "Some cash, a few clothes. We booked you a temporary room at a motel." They were kicking me out. On my 18th birthday, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood up slowly, looked at them with the calm expression I'd mastered after years in a house that valued silence over emotion. "Thank you," I said. Soft, clear, then picked up the bag. They didn't notice how tightly my fingers clenched the strap. They had no idea I already knew. Because 3 weeks earlier, I found something they never expected. That night, while digging for old records to fill out a scholarship form, I opened the hallway cabinet upstairs, the one where they stored tax returns and banking papers. At the very bottom, under a stack of dull folders, was an old yellow envelope, unsealed, in scrawled handwriting. "For L. Wexler." I didn't know who that was, but what was inside stopped my heart. A copy of my birth certificate. My name was still there, Katie Monroe? But under Mother was a name I'd never seen, Madison Wexler. The father line was blank. I sat on the cold floor, heart pounding. Madison Wexler? Who was she? For the next 3 weeks, I searched. I didn't ask anyone in the house. It was just me and the internet. I read everything I could about Madison Wexler, and then I found the old articles. Really old, but still archived in the city library. The news said Madison was a psychology researcher at a neurotherapy center in the northern suburbs. There had been a major scandal. She accused the center's director of misconduct during experimental treatments on women. Not long after, she was detained for unstable behavior and sent to a psychiatric facility called Maplewood Hills. The records stopped there. No new photos, no updates. No one mentioned her after 2004. The more I read, the colder I felt. I didn't know if she was still alive. I'd never heard her name mentioned in our home. But the question that kept me up for nights was one no one could answer. Why was I, daughter of a whistleblower, adopted by 2 people financially tied to the very center she exposed? My 18th birthday wasn't the day I lost a family. It was the day I realized I'd been living in a carefully crafted lie. I left the house I'd lived in for 15 years without looking back. The suburban home with the white porch and shuttered windows was nothing more than a stage set for a play I never agreed to be in. The motel they booked for me sat next to a highway, reeking of bleach, damp carpet, and stale air. I couldn't sleep that night. My canvas bag sat by the bed, holding 2 outfits, some loose change, and the yellow envelope I'd hidden for weeks. The only thing of real value I had. Early the next morning, I went to the city library, the only place I felt safe. I sat at the public computers, my hands still trembling, and typed, Madison Vexler. This time, I dug deeper, not news articles or public records, but digital archives, leaked documents, and posts on investigative journalism forums. And then, a new name kept appearing next to my birth mother's. Dr. Colin Harrow. He was the former medical director of a private treatment center called the Harrow Institute for Integrated Mental Health. According to documents from 20032-004, Madison was the lead specialist until she filed an internal report on unethical practices, including unapproved drug trials and deep behavioral interventions on female patients with no guardians. 1 week after her report, she was suspended, a month later institutionalized at Maplewood Hills for long-term observation. Her records vanished. Her name never appeared again. I printed everything, stuffed it into my coat pocket. On the way back, I remembered the letters Greg Monroe used to get, envelopes from something called the Vail Foundation. I thought it was charity. But that same name appeared in a footnote of one of the articles I'd just printed. The Vail Foundation, a private fund that supported the Harrow Institute from 2000 to its closure in 2005. My blood ran cold. Was Greg just a regular adoptive dad? Or a cog in this entire system? I pulled up public donation records. A 2011 donor report listed Gregory Monroe as a distinguished benefactor to the Vail Foundation, with a note, special contribution to post-recovery support programs. My chest tightened. He never talked about therapy, never visited hospitals, but he donated to a foundation tied to the place where my mother was locked away. No doubt remained. They knew. Greg and his wife, the woman who once held my hand when I was sick, who helped me pick a prom dress, they knew everything, and they stayed silent. That night, I didn't return to the motel. I found an all-night coffee shop, took a booth in the farthest corner, and opened my old notebook. I wrote it all down, names, dates, addresses, connections. A map formed out of invisible strings. And at the center of it all was Madison Vexler, the woman who lost everything to speak the truth, then was buried by a diagnosis. I didn't know if she was alive. I didn't know if Maplewood Hills still existed, or had been renamed, dissolved, or erased like so many truths. But I knew I had to find out. I started calling medical records offices, notary centers, and mental health facilities around the Harrow area. Most said no. Some said they had no records. But one older woman at the state archives paused when I asked about Madison Vexler. "You're not the first to ask about her," she said. Then hung up. That answer chilled me more than anything. Who was the first? Did they find Madison? Or did they disappear? I didn't know what I was stepping into, but this wasn't just about my identity anymore. This was about a mother silenced, and the truth I was determined to uncover. It took me nearly 2 weeks to track down Maplewood Hills. It had closed in 2010. No website, no public files. On most maps, it was just a gray, unnamed patch. But an old post from a forum on psychiatric care anomalies gave me a new name. Clearhaven Recovery Center, said to have taken in special transfers after Maplewood shut down. I called Clearhaven from a payphone, using a fake name I'd prepared. The receptionist said they couldn't share patient info, but hesitated when I asked about Madison Vexler. She told me to hold, then transferred the call to another woman, calm but cautious. "What is your relationship to Miss Vexler?" she asked. Without pause, I said, "I'm her daughter." Silence. 10 seconds. Then, "You can visit, but only during restricted hours, and you'll have to sign a no-recording agreement." I agreed immediately. The next morning, I took the 6:15 bus to the northern suburbs. Clearhaven sat in a misty hillside, isolated like it had been deliberately forgotten. The main building was old stone, overgrown with dry ivy, the entrance shaded by tall pines. The air smelled of damp wood and antiseptic, sharp and cold. The front desk gave me a short form to sign, then called upstairs. Room 14, second floor, 15 minutes only. My heart pounded as I reached the white-painted wooden door. I gripped the handle, inhaled deeply, and gently pushed it open. She was sitting there, a thin woman with snow-white hair framing a gaunt face. She faced the window, where sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting shadows on a stack of faded books. The room was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat echo. I whispered, "Miss Madison?" She turned slowly. Her eyes met mine, dark brown, deep and sad, but still holding something. Recognition? Hope? I wasn't sure, but she didn't look away. I stepped forward and sat down across from her. "My name is Katie," I said, voice trembling. "You had a daughter, 18 years ago." Tears welled up in her eyes, but none fell. She blinked, then nodded slowly. "I remember," she said, barely audible but clear. "I never forgot." I pulled out the birth certificate copy and printed articles, placing them on the table. "I found everything. I know you didn't leave me. They took me." She exhaled, as if something heavy had been lifted after nearly 2 decades. They said I was paranoid, that I imagined things, but I knew. I knew too much. I waited. Then she continued, steadier this time. "They tested drugs on patients no one knew. No guardians, no consent forms. I gathered proof, sent it to the board. A week later, I was suspended. A month later, confined." I swallowed. "Greg Monroe," I said, "the man who adopted me. Was he involved?" She trembled. "Not from cold, but from that name. He coordinated funding from the Vale Foundation, one of Harrow's protectors. When I was taken, your file was sealed. I tried to stop it. I signed letters of objection, but then they said I was no longer legally competent." I realized my fists were clenched. One question burned at the edge of my throat. "So, did he adopt me just to cover it all up?" Madison nodded, slowly, never breaking eye contact. "You are living proof of a buried abuse case. They thought keeping you close would silence me forever." I don't know when I started crying. Madison reached out, hesitant, unsure. I took her hand, thin, cold, but warmer than any embrace I'd ever known. "Before I left," she whispered, still gazing out the window, "Be careful. They still watch. It's been years, but people like Greg don't let go." As I stood up, a nurse knocked. "Time's up." I turned back one last time. "I'll come back, and I'll get you out of here." She didn't reply, just nodded, lips moving in a faint whisper I had to lean in to hear. Never trust anyone in a white coat. I left Clearhaven just as the rain began to fall. Not a downpour, but cold enough to remind me that time wasn't on my side. With every step away from that facility, I felt like I had opened a door that could never be closed again. Madison, my birth mother, wasn't crazy. She was a victim. And if I did nothing, I'd be next in line to be silenced. A few days later, I returned to the old library, my first stop on this journey. I sat in the same corner, reopened all the files I'd gathered, this time with eyes no longer searching for roots, but preparing for a real confrontation. In the pile of faded printouts, one name appeared again and again. Judith Campbell, a former nurse who worked at Maplewood Hills from 1998 to 2010. In an anonymous post on a psychiatric care forum, someone mentioned she was the last one still willing to remember. It took me 3 days to trace disconnected phone numbers and abandoned email addresses before I found an old mailbox address in Michigan. I took a chance and sent a handwritten letter. Short, sincere, along with a copy of my birth certificate and the article about the Harrow Institute. I didn't expect a reply. But exactly 1 week later, I got an email from an anonymous address. I know who your mother is. Meet me Saturday, back entrance of Larkspur Cafe, 10 a.m. Come alone. I took the earliest bus to Michigan, carrying all my files and my notebook. The Larkspur Cafe was small and quiet, tucked beside a weekend flea market. The back alley had a row of old wooden benches and a metal door leading to the basement. She was already waiting. Gray hair, wool coat, a sharp face with eyes strangely alert. "You're Madison's daughter," she said right away, no hesitation. She was my colleague, the only one in that whole system brave enough to speak the truth. I was emotional, but I didn't waste time. I need proof. Not to tell a sad story, to expose them. Judith looked at me, then opened her bag. She pulled out an old flash drive, faded label. GHT_pilot_1. "This is a copy of treatment records I stole before I left the facility," she said. "It includes med logs, patient codes, and a video Madison once kept as evidence." I took it, hands shaking with a mix of hope and fear. "Is it enough?" I asked. "Not yet," she said, "but it's something they can't deny." Back in the city, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who understood law, media, and how to survive telling the truth. One name came to mind: Marla Reyes, a former investigative journalist fired from a major network for chasing a case tied to shady medical funds. I found her personal blog, updated only every few months but packed with forgotten scandals. I emailed her with the subject line, "I have video, internal documents, and the names of those holding my mother hostage." Less than an hour later, she called. "You joking?" Marla's voice was deep and dry. "A story like this cost me my career, but it could win your name back." There was a pause, then she said, "Meet me at the old studio, 3rd floor, 7 p.m. tomorrow. Bring everything. And don't bring anyone." The next night, I stepped into a dusty room that used to be a newsroom, now Marla's archive and safe house for truths no one else dared publish. She booted up a computer. I handed her the drive. When the video played, blurry footage of a woman restrained in a dim room, a doctor's cold voice asking about post-injection emotions, and Madison's shaky but clear response. Marla's expression changed. "We've got something real," she said, "but we have to do this right. Otherwise, people will disappear. For good." I looked her in the eye, steady. If my mom had the courage to stand alone, I can stand in the storm. We'll expose everything, every name, every crime. Marla nodded. And so the battle began. Not with bullets, with light. The light of truth, aimed straight at places they thought no one would ever touch. We didn't leak anything right away. Marla was clear. If you want to bring down a system, you don't swing once and run. You hit from all sides, all at once, before they can clean up the mess. Over the next 3 weeks, we worked like time was burning. Marla contacted 3 former attorneys who'd investigated medical ethics violations. I sent copies of the video and files to a whistle platform she trusted. Judith the nurse agreed to write an official statement, attaching an old voice recording of Madison from a therapy session. By April 12th, everything went live. The video leaked online, a long-form article hit the homepage of an independent investigative news site, a podcast aired on unauthorized medical testing on vulnerable women, and the names, Greg Monroe and Colin Harrow, were listed as board members of the Vail Foundation. Social media exploded. What began as a quiet story turned into a movement. People whose loved ones had been held at Maplewood or Clearhaven came forward. A woman in Portland posted video of her mother being forced to take trial drugs, while a leaked document revealed Vail funded a program called Female Behavioral Reconditioning, a phrase that sent chills down spines. 3 days later, the state attorney general opened a formal investigation. Federal authorities stepped in. Police raided the Vail Foundation offices and Clearhaven. Greg Monroe and Colin Harrow were invited to cooperate, though their lawyers told the press all accusations are baseless. Me? I had one goal left: get my mother out before it was too late. We arrived at Clearhaven on a gray morning. Marla drove. Judith came with us. I brought proof that Madison wasn't just a patient. She was a victim. And that she had a legal next of kin? Me. The intake staff hesitated, but when Marla handed over a copy of the subpoena from the prosecutor's office, they couldn't refuse. Within the hour, my mother was brought out, still with silver hair, but eyes no longer filled with fear. I held her hand tight. "Let's go home, Mom." Madison didn't ask where or why now. She just smiled. The kind of smile that waits 19 years for a single moment. We didn't go straight back to the city. Judith arranged for her to stay temporarily at a support center for former healthcare whistleblowers. There were therapists, legal help, but most of all, respect. At the first court hearing, I sat in the back row. Greg Monroe walked in, no longer the quiet father who once forced me to eat vegetables. He looked straight at me, and his eyes weren't guilty. They were afraid. The prosecutor opened with the first piece of evidence, the video of Madison being interrogated in a locked room, her face confused and trembling. The courtroom went silent. Then came the unapproved medication logs, internal reports signed by Monroe and Harrow. Each piece stripped away another layer of their mask. When the prosecutor said my name, Katie Monroe, as a child illegally adopted during an internal whistleblower cover-up, someone gasped. I heard a pen drop. Marla gently squeezed my shoulder. "You did what they thought was impossible. You shattered the silence they built everything on." I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I hadn't let myself rest. Weeks later, an anonymous account sent me one email. "You're not the first, but you're the first to survive." Attached was one name, Rebecca Harlow, a former journalism student who investigated Maplewood and vanished in 2012. I'd thought Claire Rothman was the only one to ever touch this secret, but it seems there were others. More truths still buried. I sent a reply asking to meet, and just one day later, I received a photo of a woman now living in Nebraska under an alias. Short hair, glasses, cautious eyes, but unmistakable. Rebecca is alive. 1 month after the first hearing, I sat with Madison at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She had started drinking coffee again, black, no sugar, no cream. And for the first time, I saw her smile. Soft, unguarded. Her face still showed signs of wear, but her eyes were different. Bright, steady, alive. "You know," she said, gently turning her ceramic cup. "Back then, I thought no one would believe me. No one. Everything they did was designed to make women like me look unstable." I nodded, my throat tight. During those years, my mother didn't just lose her voice. They stripped away her identity. They called her a complex case. But the only thing she was guilty of was speaking up. We didn't talk much about Greg Monroe anymore. After being formally charged with 3 counts, abuse of power, falsifying records, and unlawful interference in the adoption process, he vanished from the news. His lawyer kept denying everything, but the evidence from Judith's saved emails and the audio of him saying, "Keep the child to shut her up," was undeniable. Colin Harrow didn't fare any better. His license was revoked, and the federal investigation expanded to include every facility he'd overseen. People who had stayed silent started to speak. Some were former patients, some were family members. A few were ex-colleagues who had once been too scared to question anything. Now they found each other, in forums, support groups, and more importantly, in the public release of documents. Marlo, who'd helped me every step of the way, was invited back to national television to talk about the case. She declined. "I didn't do this for the spotlight. I did it so girls like you don't have to walk through the dark alone." She agreed only to record an exclusive podcast where the story was told by me, by Judith, by Madison, and finally, by someone I never thought I'd find again, Rebecca Harlow. She reached out after hearing her name mentioned at the hearing. In her first email, Rebecca wrote only one line. I didn't get to finish back then, but I never gave up. We met at a community center in Denver. She was living under a new identity but still had all the documents she'd gathered back in 2012. Records, handwritten letters, copies of Madison's medical reports sent to a human rights group. She'd been threatened, her laptop stolen, her bank account frozen, but she survived. And now, she chose to step into the light with us. We founded a group called the Silence Breakers, a nonprofit supporting victims who were unlawfully institutionalized, labeled unstable just for speaking the truth. We offered legal resources, mental health support, and, most importantly, a place where they could be heard. The media called us a quiet revolution in mental health care, but to me, it was simply one step toward justice for my mother, and for hundreds of others like her. I still keep the original birth certificate in my coat pocket, not to remind myself who I am, but to never forget where I came from. I was once blindfolded, treated like property, lied to, but I walked away from all of it, not just to survive, but to act. Someone once asked if I regretted stirring it all up, for confronting the people who raised me, who once called me daughter. I answered, I didn't stir anything up. I just uncovered the truth they tried to bury. And my mother, now living in a small apartment near the coast, spends her mornings watering flowers, reading books, and sometimes writing letters to former Clearhaven patients we're still helping reintegrate into society. One day, she left me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a handwritten line. You are the only reason I didn't give up. I didn't respond. I just folded it back, tucked it into my wallet next to the photo of us taken the day she walked out of Clearhaven. We didn't say anything that day. We just held hands and stepped through the gates. For the first time, unlocked. That silence, at last, was freedom. My story isn't just about finding my birth mother. It's about reclaiming the truth and finding myself. From a girl pushed out of her home with nothing but a small bag and a blurry past, I rose to expose a system built on manipulation and psychological abuse that lasted for decades. I'm no longer Katie Monroe, the child they tried to hide, but the voice that chose to rise, to defend those once forced into silence. And that, to me, is true freedom. What do you think about Katie's journey and the truth she uncovered? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful, emotional, and inspiring family stories to come.